This is lecture number 8 in International Human Rights. What I'd like to reflect on is the relationship of major powers, middle powers, and minor powers and human rights, and often the tensions that are a part of that. When we think of major powers in the world today, certainly throughout the Cold War, the dominant major powers of the time from 47 certainly to 1989 and shortly thereafter when Gorbachev made it very clear that Russia or the former USSR could not continue as it was, and then the fall of the Berlin Wall. The two major powers at the time battling over the future, in many ways, at that time, as they understood it, of civilization, was the United States and the USSR. Now, these two major powers at the time were quite involved through their client states, the United States and Central Latin America, Africa, Middle East, the USSR in Eastern Europe, many of its client states in Africa and the Middle East as well, engaged in a variety of human rights violations. Death squads were trained in the United States in Fort Benning, Georgia, sent into Central America, the impact there in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. The United States would back authoritarian states in Latin America, Pinochet and many others, the support for Israel in the Middle East. The USSR, on the other hand, would back states in Eastern Europe that repressed basic human rights, and hence the rise of people like Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, rebelling against this, and they become, in one sense, in different ways, icons of freedom in Eastern Europe. And so within the leftist tradition in the major powers of the time, economic and social, cultural rights to some degree were held high, but the repression of political, civil, legal rights. The United States, on the other hand, even though claiming to hold high political, civil, and legal rights, would support states that in fact repressed those very things. And so you get in these major powers in the Cold War, the one rhetorically holding political, civil, legal rights high and yet supporting states and sending death squads into states to undermine those rights, and the leftist regimes doing much the same thing for different reasons. And so when we have major powers in the Cold War, we can see very clearly how these basic rights they hold high often were undermined by very draconian measures, if not domestically, then certainly in their foreign policy ideals. Now, as we move out of the Cold War, the major, the middle, and the minor powers, we need to ask ourselves today, who are some of the major powers? Who are some of the middle powers, and who are some of the minor powers? How do minor powers even get their voice heard, much less recognized in the theater of world politics? And what does one do with major powers when they themselves are engaged in significant human rights violations? And so let's look at 3 major powers at the present time, and I will smuggle a 4th one in here, and why certain major powers will not interfere with other major powers when there's obvious human rights violations in those countries, but where there's minor powers, they will act very, very quickly in the name of human rights, in attempting to end these human rights violations. So we all know, for example, that China is not only a major power, but it's increasingly become a Goliath power in the world of politics. Economically, it's a powerhouse. It has a fast-growing military, one of the fastest-growing militaries in the world. Its fingers reach increasingly so across the face of the earth. We know it certainly has its ambitions in Hong Kong. It has its eyes on Taiwan. The treatment of the Tibetans is appalling. recent reports, obviously, of treatment of Muslims that our own ambassador to the UN, Bob Ray, has dealt with, reveal very clearly atrocious human rights violations, certain types of Christians and Muslims, human rights activists in China. Now, why do no states, when they claim to hold high the importance of rights, interfere with it? Well, what state is going to deal with China in any significant way? Because the implications are horrendous. Uh, Weaker states, historically, for example, Gaddafi in Libya, Hussein in Iraq, or in present time Burma or Myanmar, our present ambassador to the UN can go in there and critique the terrible treatment of the Rohingya Muslims. But these are minor states. So as middle powers like Canada, we of course can condemn them for what's going on, but it really makes no serious impact on us, and we can even use all sorts of restrictions, but very little is going to happen. We can invade countries, as I mentioned, like Libya, Iraq, and other countries. They're not superpowers, so if our interests are interfered with in a big power, then we're not going to do anything. Smaller powers, the United States will act very, very quickly. So China is obviously at the forefront of one of the most powerful major powers at the present time, but also one of the leading human rights violators in the world today. We're not likely to do anything. Russia, even though a bit of a sleeping bear under Putin at the present time, and we certainly are aware of the last few weeks with Navalny going back and the huge protesters in Russia arguing that this poisoning of the major opponent of Putin. But what's the West likely to do? They're not going to do very, very much at all. Putin going into Crimea. Right now, the UN does have in Latvia forces, NATO anyway. And so it's an attempt to put brakes on Putin, but nothing much is really done in terms of the internal domestic policy. Minor states like, say, Syria at the present time, what can be done? And so why is so little being done? And certainly since the rise of the Arab Spring, the atrocities that have continued there, given it's become a football field of clashes of different types of Muslims, and also the interests of Russia in Syria, and whose version of where Assad should be going in Syria. And so the carnage in Syria and the tragedy which is followed, this is obviously a minor power, but nobody is stepping in to solve the problem in Syria because the major powers have vested interests in the region. Saudi Arabia, another one, is a huge oil producing country for the West. Treatment of the Shia Muslims in a Sunni dominated state. Yemen, Canada sends light armored vehicles over there. Very little is said about that, whereas we can condemn, as I mentioned earlier, Myanmar. Rwanda, historically, that took off, that violence very, very quickly between the Hutu and the Tutsi. Gratefully so, in a situation like that, the Peace and Reconciliation Commission is sorting things out in Rwanda. But Africa, as of the 5 major regions of the world, Stephen Lewis, who was a former Canadian ambassador to the UN and became the key figure in Africa, did the Massey lectures, and he looked at the whole AIDS crisis more than a decade ago there, and how Canada in its foreign policy has virtually forgotten this dark hole, this nation, and the clashes between these various states. And Stephen Lewis pleaded for Canadians to be acutely aware of the suffering and tragedy and the clashes in these various states between Arabs and Muslims and Africans and Christians and Muslims, South Africa. And why is so little substantively being done. We're fortunate at UFV to have Edward Akufo, who's probably in political science one of the top scholars in terms of Canadian foreign policy in Africa. And yet here's areas of the world, minor states, torn within many of these states and between states, whether Uganda or Ethiopia or Nigeria, conflicts and so that. Yet nothing is really substantively done because they're not significant either to many middle powers and certainly not to many of the major powers in the world. And so when we look at major powers, middle powers, and minor powers in the world, often either minor powers are just ignored, they're exploited, they have been historically colonized, but many of them are living with the results in the decolonization period and the wars between ethnic groups, between states, within states in Africa, and even regional organizations can't seem to solve these problems, and you certainly don't, and the UN itself is inadequate to handle these. Iran, for example, in its clashes with Saudi Arabia, again a country, terrible oppression going on there, yet no one really knows what to do. And of course, with the notion of state sovereignty, it becomes a dilemma of what does one do when, on the one hand, human rights are held very, very high, and yet, on the other hand, state sovereignty is equally held high. What trumps what when push comes to shove? And in certain states, middle powers and superpowers will act. In others, if it's irrelevant or if it's going to cause too much violence, then the status quo is just left to unfold as it will. And so when we think of human rights and major powers like the United States, its support, its engagement with Saudi Arabia, what will be Biden's decision contra Trump's, and how he will deal with Iran. Is he just going to walk the diplomatic route and ignore some of the atrocities there? Obviously, the ongoing support of Israel and the impact of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, refugee camps will continue. So a superpower like the United States, with the new administration, many are obviously beating their drums in joy, if you're on the center-left, that Biden and Harris have come to power. But as a superpower, is he and Kamala Harris likely to make any serious decisions that uphold human rights in their foreign policy, even though he's claiming domestically to deal with, and legitimately so, issues of First Nations and blacks and women's rights? What's going to be the nature of the foreign policy? Will he just ignore these human rights violations for the purpose of, for diplomacy, for the purpose of oil trading, for the purpose of supporting the state of Israel, not wanting to offend either the Christian or the Jewish Zionists in the United States? So when we think superpowers, middle powers, how do middle powers like Canada leverage themselves, either through the United Nations, General Assembly, working with various regional organizations through economic ties, whereas Canada is simply silent on all sorts of human rights violations, even though as a state we claim that it is significant in terms of defining our identity. So human rights, when we reflect on them, it's very important to distinguish between major powers, middle powers, minor powers, and why often middle and major powers will hold human rights high if it's in their advantage, but when it's not, then they basically go silent as they engage one another in any minimally meaningful way. And so when dealing with human rights at the larger political level, important to distinguish between major, middle, minor powers, and what can each do or not do in guarantee and protecting rights that go from ecological rights. I mean, no one's going to challenge hardly China, which is the worst polluter in the world. And so what can be said there, what can be done in dealing with that, and often there is not much being done. And so, how does one engage those things ecologically and workers' rights? And so, in thinking human rights, thinking structurally, thinking politically, important to look at why are certain states, uh, why are they silent in human rights violations? Why are not major states challenged on human rights violations? Um, Often for the simple reason it has more to do with realpolitik than meaningful political idealism.